Baik, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan, Rahayu. Peace be upon us all. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests and participants here at Pullman, Jakarta, Indonesia, and also online across Indonesia and everywhere in the world, perhaps. Good evening. I'm indeed delighted. Hi, Professor Gary. I'm indeed delighted to inform that there are over 500 participants who are present today online and on-site. Thank you for joining us today in the Regional Symposium on Instructional Design and Technology 2022 or Simposium Regional Pengembang Teknologi Pembelajaran 2022. Welcome to the second session of the symposium with our special guest from Manchester, United Kingdom. But before I get into the introduction, allow me to remind you that this session will primarily be conducted in English. Therefore, kindly have the questions prepared in English for later in the Q&A segment. The timeline for this session is to be estimated around 1 hour with 30 minutes for the presentation and 30 minutes for Q&A segment. Thank you. So let us begin, shall we? Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests and participants, it is an honor for me to have the opportunity moderating for our special speaker for today's evening session. Allow me to introduce Professor Gary Madorem to you all. Let's give a big round of applause to welcome him in the room. Welcome, Professor Gary, and good day to you, considering that it is still around noon there in Manchester, if I'm not mistaken. For your information, today, Professor Gary, we have 514 participants to be exact joining with us, consisting of 124 participants joining us physically in the room and 390 participants joining us virtually. So, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Gary Madorem is now an honorary senior research fellow in education at the University of Manchester Institute of Education, where he taught for 30 plus on MAs in TESOL, digital technology in education, and the PG Cert in higher education. His main teaching focused on technology-supported learning with a particular interest in technology-supported language learning. His research interests lie in the area of language teacher education at a distance with a more recent focus on using mobiles to support teacher education in low-resourced contexts. His most recent funded projects are a Grand Challenges Research Fund project on teacher professional development through practitioner research in Côte d'Ivoire, a project with adult ESOL teachers of refugees in Manchester developing materials for online delivery during the pandemic, a newly awarded project setting up an online resource and community of practice for teachers in India. He is also currently working for the British Council Sub-Saharan Africa team, managing a variety of online activities with teacher educators and teachers making use of tools like WhatsApp, Telegram, and Zoom. Let's have a closer look at his recent publication to understand more about his expertise. In 2022, he published his works on exploring the shaping of English language teacher practices while working with refugees and asylum seekers during the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2021, he wrote about developing English language teachers and language teaching in a time of pandemic, learning from volunteer experiences during the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown, and a mixed method study of how instructor designed for learning in online and distance education. And in 2020, his publication centers around WhatsApp-supported language teacher development, a case study in the Zatari refugee camp, and exploring mobile support for English language teachers in a context of conflict, Syrian refugee teachers in Jordan. Professor Gary, these are very impressive and interesting area of research. I'm glad that this can be shared with all of us here to be read further later on. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests and participants, today, or this evening, Professor Gary Madaram will present a topic that he has specifically prepared for all of us. It is about reflections on using technology-supported learning in challenging circumstances. Without further ado, please welcome Professor Gary Madaram. To Professor Gary Madaram, the room is yours, and you may start now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. How will we see the slides? How does that work? Okay, all right. So, yeah, so I'm going to, as has been said, and thank you very much for that nice introduction, and thank you for welcoming me to this conference, and I'm very pleased to be speaking here, and I hope you're having a great time both face-to-face and online. So if you'd like to move on to the next slide, please. Yeah, so this work, as was suggested in the introduction, focuses around teaching in circumstances that are considered challenging. And development goal 4, which has its sort of sub-target of 4C, which is looking at trying to increase the supply of qualified teachers. And, you know, that SDG goal is mainly sort of focused on issues of trying to develop learning outcomes for children in schools, but it also has this subsection of teacher education. And the Sustainable Development Goals recognize that teachers are vital in the work that they do in raising children's learning outcomes. So it's really important to focus on teachers. Now, one of the big problems that we face is that a lot of teachers in the world, and this is in many subject areas, but in my own specific area of English language teaching, often people go into teaching without very much training. I mean, it does vary considerably across the world, but certainly in a lot of the contexts that I've worked in the more recent years, people either have limited training or they don't have opportunities to develop their training beyond maybe the initial training course that they went on. So if we could have the next slide, please. Now, it might be difficult for you to read this, but we will focus in on this. So I was recently asked to do a panel discussion in the Americas. This is through the British Council, and they sent me a whole series of questions. And I thought, oh, well, okay, if I'm going to do this talk to Indonesia, I mean, it's very, very much related. I would focus on some of these questions, and I'm basically going to look at the first 3 questions, and we'll hone in on them, and I'll talk a little bit about what I think about those issues, and then obviously you can make comments in the question and answer. Originally, I did have some Mentimeter questions to interact with that, but the technology didn't allow me to do that. So if you could move on to the next slide. So the first question is, they asked me, could you speak a little bit about the kinds of strategies and technologies that you've found useful when it comes to helping learners and teachers? So this got me reflecting around issues to do with strategies particularly, and certainly in the work that I've done over the years, one of the things that I've become very conscious of is the particular context. Now, obviously, in any country, never mind in the different countries that I've worked in, you have a variety of contexts. I guess you will work in, some of you will work in large cities, perhaps like Jakarta. Some of you will work in smaller towns like Ujung Pandang, which I've actually been to, and some of you might work in very rural areas in small schools, and certainly the project that I read about in Adning's thesis was certainly reflected that kind of process, the fact that people are working in very different contexts. So strategies will depend on the context, and things obviously have changed over time. Second factor that we need obviously to consider is the learners. So age is an important factor. Also the type of school. I work in a context where you have both public and private schools, and private schools can mean a number of different things. So we often find ourselves talking about, if you talk about the private sector in the United Kingdom, that's very different from talking about the private sector in a country like India, for example, where often the private sector can mean schools run by non-governmental organizations, NGOs as we refer to them. And in Côte d'Ivoire, where I've done quite a lot of work over the last few years, the private sector is a sector that's growing, and it's growing partly because the central state, the Ministry of Education, doesn't have the finance to be able to develop its own new state schools, and partly because some people are unhappy about the state school system. But one of the features of that particular context is a lot of the teachers who work in the private sector, they're often teachers who work in the state school who do a second job or sometimes a third job to help them financially. So, the type of school is very important, and the quality of the school as well is also important. So these things make a difference. And teachers also are varied. They sit in at various stages in their career. And as I said, they're trained or not trained. In my context with language teaching, sometimes they have a very low language level. They don't really know their subject area very well. Gender plays a massive factor. I've mentioned the number of jobs, people's age, and so on. So beliefs about teaching and learning, and how much control they have within their schools, their agency, whether they're supported by the local management, local authorities, school inspectors. All of these kinds of people make a difference. So what a teacher does in their specific classroom is affected by a lot of factors. So the issues in terms of strategies really makes a difference. So next slide, please. So I found this when thinking about the issue of technologies. I found this list from this guy Michael Trucano, who works at the World Bank, very helpful when I'm trying to select technology. And one of the biggest problems that you face, and Michael Trucano is very hard on this in some of the writing that he does, but it's true. So many times we try and introduce new technologies into context without really thinking about whether it's actually going to work very effectively. So but the point that he makes at the beginning there is the best technology is the one you already know how to use and can afford. So that's really quite critical. That one of the things that I've always worked on in the work that I've done is to try and think about what sort of technologies are already out there, rather than sort of thinking, oh, we've got this wonderful new technology, let's try and introduce this into a new context. Another point there, again, if we come back to the Sustainable Development Goal 4, you see a point 3 there, treat teachers like the problem, and they will be. So teachers are often seen as the problem, rather than actually asking teachers what they need, what their experiences are, what technologies they have, and so on and so forth. Another thing that's often forgotten about is the content. When technology supported learning is introduced into different contexts, it's often introduced, technology is provided, let's say a tablet or something like that. Computers in the past, old-fashioned sort of desktop computers, they were just introduced, but there was nothing to do with them. And a final point, I think I'll won't go through the whole list. So number 8 there, put sustainability first. So if you're thinking about running a project with a piece of technology, you've got to think of, well, is it going to continue after I've introduced this particular technology? When I walk away from this project, are things going to carry on working? So that's a very useful list, and I think sort of helps to underpin the thinking that when I think about technologies. Can we have the next slide, please? So a second question then was about the pandemic. Because I think all as technologists, we became kind of clear that there was a difference that the pandemic made. It had all sorts of negative aspects in terms of people like ourselves who are learning technologists. It made a significant difference to our understanding and our use of technology. But still, we face a situation. What have we learned from that? And I think we learned that we needed to be ready for things like the pandemic, and we need to be ready for issues like climate change. The idea is that somehow, we're kind of ready for the next pandemic, but we're not really. We need we need to think about, a response plan. We need to invest in the way that teachers are trained. So one of the clear things that came out from the working in the context of the pandemic, that yes, teachers did cope in many cases, but they would have coped so much better if they'd have had some form of pre-training. And of course, now we've moved back to a world where we have, we're back in regular school teaching and regular university work in most parts of the world, not everywhere, but in most parts of the world. We've kind of, we're beginning to forget that, but still, it's important to think about the way that we get teachers to engage in that, the sort of content that needs to be provided. So these are important issues to think about, and there are several reports mentioned there, and if you want to follow them up, I don't know how you'll get access to the references, but there are references at the end. So next slide, please. Other things that we learned that I think that were important was that we had issues in terms of equity, or we didn't have equity when it came to device use. So if we're going to think about using technology in learning or in teacher education, we have to think about how best to provide people with the sorts of technologies that we're interested in. And another thing that was also important is then when you think about special educational needs, for example, and providing particular facilities for people with special educational needs. So, for example, like subtitles, they actually impact generally on the kinds of ways that everybody can cope with it. So I don't know whether you're able to see the subtitles here, but the idea would be that that if you provide those subtitles, maybe people they're initially provided for people who perhaps are hearing impaired, but they're also able to support the kinds of people who kind of could do with support with reading. So there are lots of issues that we learned that. So attitudes and approaches towards technology use. So generally, I think it's generally understood that actually attitudes became more positive towards technology and the use of technology to support learning in schools and in universities. And if you look at, there's an EduCause report that came out quite recently, is published in 2022, that learners, even if teachers don't want to do that, learners want flexibility. They also want social interaction and academic engagement. So those sorts of things are important. So even if we've moved back to a point of not relying exclusively on technology to provide learning, people still want that. They want the flexibility that technology provides, so that blended notion. But the thing that we learned was that social action, interaction is also very important. So the idea of having a more blended approach is something that is important. But still, again, also is that notion of content.